Hello and welcome to another edition of the Ducks Confidential podcast. I am James Crepea, joined as always by my fellow Ducks beat reporter Ryan Clarke, and we will be doing a bit of a synopsis of Oregon spring football practice, which of course wrapped up a couple weeks ago now with the spring game, or shortly thereafter, publicly for the spring game with the practice of one more practice thereafter, and then go over what has been a busy last few weeks of personnel additions for Oregon men's and women's basketball. And we'll kind of, for those who have obviously been following along the way, they know all the various additions, but now that we have a pretty good sense of what the entirety of the rosters will be in the inaugural Big Ten season for the Ducks in both men's and women's basketball. Women's, we really have a sense. On the men's side, a little bit more clarity still with the N'Faly Dante situation, but we'll get to that coming up as well. But we start with spring football and the capping off of this spring. And obviously, again, yes, at the spring game, but we're not going to wade into all those statistics. It's been a couple of weeks. Plus, let's not make more of one scrimmage than, just because it happens to be the one we saw publicly versus the ones we didn't. But your impressions and takeaways as a whole, Ryan, from, yes, the spring game and what we got to see, but more so in totality from what we got to hear over the course of the month of April, and then, yes, with the one public display by way of the statistics and the output and the production and et cetera.
Yeah, no, I mean, any college football program, any elite college football program that you're around, they're going to tout their talent. They're going to say they've got a great group, that, they're focused, that they're improving, et cetera, all of those sort of cliches, the coach speak that you're going to hear anywhere. But genuinely, what we've seen and what we've heard over these last couple of weeks, this is an incredibly talented Oregon roster, and one that continues to grow, obviously, through the transfer portal, with all the different additions over the last couple of weeks and throughout the spring. But just the sheer talent and experience was what stood out to me more than anything else. The amount of work that has been done in the portal to build out a veteran, physical, roster that fits the mold of what is necessary to succeed in the Big Ten. They've been showcasing that not only in their speech, but you even look at the spring game. You can take so much out of those sort of scrimmages, right? The conclusions are not necessarily predictive from something like that, or from any scrimmage or practice. It's all up in the air, but you take it for what it is, and you see what this team looks like on paper, particularly that defensive side. They are showing people around the country that they are one of the better rosters in the country, and how Dan Lanning and his staff are able to bring this group together come fall and try to achieve that obvious goal remains to be seen. But really, the biggest thing for me is just the sheer volume of talent that they have this year. It's potentially the most talented Oregon team ever.
Yeah, in terms of certainly an overall depth of it, without question. And obviously this offseason, the key area that they did the biggest degree of overhaul was in the secondary, and that continued even after the spring game with obviously last week's edition of Peyton Woodyard out of the portal from Alabama as well. And I say from Alabama, I mean, he was there for just spring. But
yeah, you can basically call him a high school recruit, honestly,
for all intents and purposes.
For 2024,
it really is in a practical sense. And on the side, because I realize it's things that fans do talk about and see, and then certainly pontificate quite a bit about the absurdity of it. I do think that it's the latest example of why sometimes the recruiting rankings do need a tweaking, I'll say, because not that it would have any large-scale impact to how Oregon's 2024 recruiting class would have ranked relative to Ohio State or Georgia or Alabama, for that matter. It wouldn't. But when a fan, just logically speaking, when a fan could see that a player was a top 150, depending on who you go by, top 100, whatever caliber recruit, and they're a 4-star and they're ranked whatever, but then they have only been on campus for a spring, at any campus for that matter. And then they become a transfer and they become a 3-star. That's obviously a very tough thing to logically explain to somebody. That's a very difficult thing. Now, again, this is just stuff for fans to talk about. So I bring it up mainly to point out, that's why sometimes wild recruiting rankings draw lots of attention. Not only do coaches dismiss it at times, you have to take some of this stuff with degrees of context and certain levels of scrutiny, because it doesn't always make all the most sense. But having said
sure.
that, the secondary is where they definitely overhauled. It's where they needed to overhaul. It was the area that was, from a just overall strength and weakness standpoint, in terms of depth, it was an area of great weakness for them. You saw it at the end of last season. You saw it in the losses to Washington. And look, if you're going to try in the expanded playoff era, not just about moving to the Big Ten, if you are going to be trying to not just make the playoff on a regular basis, but to do damage and to really vie for and attempt to win a national championship, you have to have the ability to go up against offenses like what you saw from Washington last year, where you have a first-round quarterback and you have 3 high-end draftable top 3-round NFL receivers. Wow, that doesn't happen very often. Really? Do we have to go back to what 2019 LSU or 2020 Alabama looked like?
Yeah, or an Ohio State that constantly reloads. I mean, it's a product of nearly all of these national champions over the last decade.
Right now, you have to, if you are going to win a national championship in this era of college football, with the rules of the game, with the spread offenses to the extent that they are, and with the caliber recruiting and caliber rosters that have won the national championship over the last 5 years in particular, you have to plan for a first-round quarterback, especially now with the possibility of needing to win 4+ games in the postseason to get there. We're not just talking about a 14 playoff or 2 games. We're talking about much longer system.
Yeah, you're getting through a gauntlet.
And, you have to go through a lot. You could potentially have to play 16, 17 games in a season. So the point is, you have to plan for a first-round quarterback and at minimum a top 2-round receiver, probably a pair of them. And I say at minimum because obviously Michigan did it in a different style. But you have to prepare. They still had a high-end quarterback. They had a highly drafted quarterback. I'm not sure about how every which thing translates necessarily or not, but I'm not a talent evaluator. Point being,
right.
You have to be prepared for a obviously very, very talented opponent or opponents, but you have to be prepared for a level of potency in the passing game. And if your secondary is a weakness whereby if your number 1 corner or number 2 corner for that matter goes out and the opponent just relentlessly targets the other side of the field, or if your top corner goes out, then they feel like they have the ability to throw at will against you. And you've seen that for multiple seasons now. This staff certainly has in the Washington games, and it predated them. Then you have to go out and answer. Well, what did they do? They go out and added 4 transfers in the secondary, before spring even gets going. 3 of whom arrived during the spring. And then, we still have Brandon Johnson to arrive here from Duke later this summer. And then you get a Peyton Woodyard as well. Yeah, that is an overhaul. That's significant. And you knew all those things before you go in, but that's an area where you're talking about depth, you're talking about the caliber of talent. That was an area that they probably had even last season. That was the area, remember, go back a year ago, Dan had talked about that he felt one of the big areas that they had changed the most was in the secondary. And it was. And it was still what it was. To now take something that was already amidst a big change and overhaul from a year ago and take it that much further. And you don't have any idea. Again, we'll certainly be the next 90 days before the season gets going, delve into a lot of these things. But, with Alexander and Muhammad, it's almost unheard of for any team to have 2 of the top 4 returning players in college football in pass defense in terms of passes defended. That doesn't mean they're the number 1 or 2 corners in the country. Don't conflate those things. But I'm talking about in ball production, in passes defended, and pass breakups and interceptions. To have 2 of the top 4 players returning in the sport in that category, nobody has that. That's unheard of. Usually because you don't pair them on the teams, but in the transfer portal era, you're going to. And to say nothing of everybody thereafter. And then you have 3 of the top 8 safeties in the same recruiting class, one of whom, in Aaron Flowers, who you got to see in the spring game, really have a big game.
Yeah.
That's an area where that was the biggest weakness to me. It has been the biggest weakness on this team and for this program for the last couple of years, for myriad reasons. It's not a matter of pointing fingers. It just has been. It goes back to recruiting from multiple different coaching staffs, multiple different position coaches, multiple different coordinators. So it spans a number of years now. Since the 2019, and even a little bit into 20, but really since the 2019 roster, which that secondary was loaded with NFL talent, after it all departed, and much of it was supposed to come back in 20, and we all know what happened. But since then, they have not been able to restock the cupboard very well. Now it looks like a team that not just aspires for, as many do, winning a national championship, but has put the pieces in place to best position themselves at virtually every position group, and at the biggest area of weakness. They overhauled it in a huge way. And I think you saw some of that, yes, including in the spring game with the ball production from some of the younger guys. You saw Dakota Fields get an interception. You saw Aaron Flowers nearly get an interception and have some ball production there. Alexander and Muhammad both get involved in pass defense, not just because they were playing their positions, but breaking up passes. So I think in terms of what you could see from a group that was really radically addressed in terms of the offseason, I thought you saw what you were hoping to see, quite frankly. While plenty of, I'm sure, wanted to see more deep passes get connected and all kinds of big plays, they also then would have been saying, oh my God, the pass defense, the secondary got overhauled, and then they allowed 3 deep passes. So
and I think that, like, the defense having success like it did in the spring game, if you're an Oregon fan, that honestly should make you more excited than Dylan Gabriel tossing 3 like amazing touchdown passes downfield, right? For them to have as much talent as they do on the offensive side, particularly at the wide receiver position, and for the defense to have as much success as it did. Now, obviously, there's the factor of, it takes time for an offense to come together. There's going to be the rust. That's something that stretches well into the early part of the actual season for a lot of teams. But for the defense overall, particularly the secondary, to have that level of success in the spring game, and really from what coaches have said throughout the spring, is a very welcome sign. Obviously, that's a major position to address, a position group to address. And throughout the defense, I mean, you go position by position, there's people talking about this being the most talented team in the country, not just in the Big Ten. And it goes beyond, obviously, the individual players on the defensive side, which is where, Dan Lanning hopes this team can make its bones. But, to retool at the quarterback position, to bulk up an already talented receiver room, to have an experienced group of running backs, and an offensive line that might not be as experienced as last season's, but by no means is taking a major step back. You don't want to say what's not to like, because obviously there are going to be shortcomings and there's going to be challenges this team faces. But man, it's something to be very excited about, and people are going to be chomping at the bit to see this team in actual action come August. So.
Yeah, we'll certainly get into again before many times over, I'm sure, before the season, in terms of just the caliber of talent on the high end and depth of it, and get perspectives on that. We've got plenty of time to get into it. But if you look at this roster, in particular, if you look at the 2 deep and our projected 2 deep as of the end of spring, and now that they're in Woodyard and Derek Harmon from Michigan State, if you just can consider by the volume of transfers, obviously, that they've got over 20 players entering their quote-unquote senior season, whether that's fourth year, fifth year, sixth year, etc. If you go by quote-unquote draftable grade players, and I mean draftable in terms of in the 2025 NFL draft, I'm not projecting what freshmen will be 2 and 3 years from now. There is a high number there. And this is for a program that obviously just had 8 guys go, plus a couple others as UDFAs. Again, if you're going to, it's amazing what happens for the teams who, basically lead the country each year in the players drafted in the NFL draft. Funny how that correlates to teams who are in the college football playoff or teams who just missed the field, like Oregon and Georgia last year. All the teams, the 4 teams who were in the playoff combined with, yes, Oregon and Georgia, were basically the top teams in the country players drafted in this past draft. It's funny how that happens. Oregon's going to have another very large draft class because of the sheer volume of transfers they added, along with the guys who are, aging through the system, where not saying all 22 of the seniors on paper are going to end up in the NFL next year. I'm not a professional talent evaluator. We'll get perspectives of people who are. But I'm telling you that between them and the draft-eligible juniors, that there's going to be a very high number. It's going to be probably larger than this year.
And building your roster out that way, too, it gives you so much greater a chance under the new format, right? Having that veteran leadership and experience, guys that have been in those positions before, some of whom have played in national championship games before or in the playoff, to where, when push comes to shove and you're in a dogfight with an extremely talented team, even if you are the much higher seed in that expanded playoff, that's just an extra edge beyond talent. Experience, to me, just seems like such a major weapon for this team, particularly given the new format.
Yeah, and with that said, last thing on the football front before we shift gears to basketball, what would, as they do enter this part of the offseason, and it certainly looks like personnel additions are likely all but wrapped up at this point, at least as far as the Ducks are concerned. What are the areas or area that you do have questions at this point, Ryan? You touched on a little bit, but obviously, again, we can wax poetic about the degrees of overhaul in the secondary or the depth of talent on really across the board, but especially on the defense that was added. But what, if any, areas of question, concern, whatever way you want to put it, are there for you? What are the areas that before the season and as we eventually get to fall camp 3 months from now, where are those areas still that you go, all right, well, there's just degrees of uncertainty for as much as they may have added that we're just not quite sure.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you lose a guy like Jackson Powers Johnson at center. Like that's a big pair of boots to fill, and how they're going to do that and how they're going to line up in the offensive line is probably my biggest question right now. Just Dan Lanning has obviously done a great job during his time here in recruiting offensive linemen and building his team from the trenches out in ways that has allowed them to have the success that they've had. But, in this year when, you're building your roster top to bottom in a physical way to match the physicality of those big Midwestern boys out in the Big Ten, how you do that with your offensive line, who steps into the position of center that Jackson Powers Johnson leaves behind, and where you line other guys up, be it more experienced players that have been in your program or guys that are just starting to make their way sort of in the similar path to a guy like JPJ who had that sort of wait and see opportunity type of career. That's the most interesting thing to me.
Yeah, I think I'm with you in that. I think the offensive line is probably the area where there's degrees of uncertainty, less so in the who and more so in just how it comes together and what it looks like. I'm not sure there's a whole lot of real position battle and uncertainty to be sorted out before the season. When you add a Matt Bedford at guard, and he's been, by the end of spring, certainly was working with the ones at the right guard position. and Poncho had already kind of taken over, but back to the Fiesta Bowl, but we saw that throughout the spring. That doesn't mean that there aren't still, to your point, some questions or uncertainty there, though, because, look, if we're going to talk about standards, and look, at the center position, it's an awfully high standard, as we went through ahead of and during and after the NFL draft with, yes, JPJ being drafted, but just the latest Oregon center to be drafted. 4 of the last 5 starting centers for the program have made it to the NFL and been drafted into the NFL. Not a lot can say that. If you're going to talk about standards, well, again, I'm not trying to pick on Poncho here, but he admitted before the Fiesta Bowl that snapping was an area that he had to work on. He was very forthright about that. And you saw multiple times in the spring game, not just with Dylan Gabriel, quarterback, that snapping was an issue. And it wasn't always on Poncho. I think one was on Dylan. I think one he should have caught the snap and just didn't.
Yeah, and even in that context, with those mistakes, those are the sort of things you do expect in the spring. But nonetheless, they did happen, and it's what we have to observe, and it is certainly a question mark.
Yeah, if it had happened to a more experienced center, it wouldn't be as shrug it off and oh, it's just a spring game, or oh, it's just a spring practice, or it's just spring in general. If it's about standards and not about all coming up with every which thing of context of age, experience, what have you, I think there'd be greater degrees of concern. So it's not a matter of flying off the handle about it. It's just a matter of saying, look, this was an area that the player himself admitted going back to the end of last season was something they had to work on. No doubt he has, and not using one day as the bellwether for whether or not he's made enough progress or not. But when you are changing both the center and quarterback in the single offseason, and you're trying to work on something like that, which is literally on a every play basis, and you see on any given day that that's still an area that has to be addressed, because it does. Now, having said that, the rest of it, though, I mean, you've got both starting tackles coming back and starting left guard coming back. That's why I say I don't want to make more of it by way of personnel uncertainty in terms of the who, more so the how. And for that matter, returning players, look, they've got areas to improve on. They may be real good and they may be part of a unit that was really good last year, but it's not as though had they all been available and had they all been available for the draft or could have entered the draft, that they all would have been first round talent a year ago. They wouldn't. They still have plenty of areas individually to grow as well. So that is an area I would say I agree with you entirely. That's a spot of greatest degrees of uncertainty and questions. But, again, as we'll certainly go through in the months ahead, certainly other areas, whether you want to get into exactly what the second line of receivers not just looks like in the who, but what the production will be. And obviously people are very excited and expecting everybody to be at peak production, but what that will actually look like, not in a fantasy world. Depth, perhaps, at linebacker, where we know what the top 2 are, most certainly, but whether it's, okay, we've heard and got to see a little bit of Devin Jackson appearing to ascend quite a bit, but what does that look like? And again, in a spring where Bryce Betcher was obviously dedicated to baseball, so you don't make more of the spring than it was, but what exactly does the second line plus at linebacker look like? So again, plenty of areas, and yes, defensive line where Jordan Birch is back, but they did lose a lot off the interior. But oh yeah, by the way, if you saw Jamari Caldwell in not just the spring game, but now Derek Harmon, and you see an Amari Washington breaking through as a young player entering his sophomore season, for as much as they may have lost in the interior defensive line, again, less so the who, more so how it'll come together. They went about overhauling and then having an internal movement by way of Washington ascending, where, lots of areas where there will be new names relative to a year ago, but there's some maybe higher production depending on what the position is, because some of these guys, again, particularly on the interior defensive line, if you take a look at it, including when they played not just the second team offensive line, including when they faced some of the starters, some of those guys are awfully impressive, including an Amari Washington, who, again, for fans going back a year ago. Yes, he didn't redshirt, as he was the only interior defensive lineman not to redshirt, and it's quite evident as to why. The degree of movement he was getting against some of the starters was very impressive for a young player. So again, somebody certainly to keep an eye on ahead of the season. As we shift gears to the basketball programs and the volume of personnel additions that they've each made here so far throughout the offseason. We'll actually start on the women's side because naturally that was the team in the program that we were talking about quite a bit throughout the month of March and April, and questions and obviously addressed much of what was a miserable season and then losing your two best players to now reach the point to where you have the volume of transfers that have come in, which we knew was highly likely in terms of the number. But now with Deja Kelly being the latest and kind of the crown jewel piece of this year's offseason personnel additions, we now have a sense of, again, the totality of this roster for the first time in the Kelly Graves era, 15 scholarship players on paper, as far as we know. Again, nobody else is in the portal, so at this point you're left to believe that everybody who's returning will be returning. A truly full Oregon women's basketball roster that has been, yes, totally overhauled. We're not going to get into what the starting lineup may or may not look like. I'm not sure they necessarily know just yet, other than I would pencil in Deja Kelly in it, along with Philly Shea, obviously. But after that, by the sheer volume of players they added, I think they're going to be sorting out exactly what the starting lineup looks like. I think there will be legitimate competition for all lines on this, if you want to call it depth chart, a rotation in the women's basketball program. Your impressions, your takeaways so far from, yes, what has been a very, very busy last month for the Oregon women's basketball program and all the additions they made, Ryan?
Yeah, no, I think that, top of the line and top of the list of things to look at there is Deja Kelly. That's somebody that not only does it say a lot about, Kelly Graves' ability to convince talented players to come to Oregon, but frankly, it showcases for somebody in Kelly who's a social media star and has a lot of sponsorships and everything else. It showcases a commitment on the NIL front for the women's basketball program that I think for a lot of Oregon fans is a welcome sight. That's somebody that you mentioned as a penciled in starter along with Filipina Shea. Yeah, those are two players that could combine to be the stars for this team next year, with a bunch of others competing for the other different positions. You think about Elisa Mevius, the transfer from Siena, somebody that's a two-way player that really, the defensive side of the ball is something that she shines at. A lot of steals in her time at Siena. Amina Muhammad is another one, the cousin of football player Jabbar Muhammad. She comes in from a program in Texas that really had a lot of success last year and had a lot of talent at her position, as a forward. So she's somebody that could really be a difference maker at 6'4". She adds more height next to Philly. I think that the way in which Kelly Graves retooled this roster, at first it seemed like they were a bit slow going in the portal, and then suddenly one day it just all hit the fan at the same time, and they brought in not only a high volume of players in that they have this full built out 15 player roster as we know of right now, but players with talent and players that will allow the Ducks, I think, to compete in the Big Ten in ways that we were not necessarily sure about at the end of last season. I mean, we're talking about a 14-game losing streak to end the year, just getting waxed by Colorado in that Pac-12 championship or the Pac-12 tournament. So that's I think a successful offseason for Kelly Graves and company. And this next year is going to be the sort of prove it year, right? You did that work, and now for somebody in Kelly Graves who's had a couple of rough years in a row, this is an opportunity to continue to prove that you are a program that is among the better ones in the country, to, I guess, regain that status after years of sort of being irrelevant.
Yeah, and you've got to see, again, it's way too early for really anybody to intelligibly get into what this team will do this upcoming season. Because case in point, before they landed Deja Kelly, which was kind of a poorly kept secret, to be quite honest with you, but be that as it may, the early projections from ESPN's Charlie Cream, he didn't have them in the field prior to that addition. Now, she's probably the most significant addition, but prior to that, the other 6 transfers were known. So even still, there was questions to be had. And one player, good as she may be, does not automatically radically change that at that point. So there are still questions by way of what exactly will this look like in terms of player rotation, starting lineups, et cetera, et cetera. Although, again, I would feel awfully confident saying Deja Kelly and Philly Shea will be 2 of the starters, and probably Amina Muhammad being a 3rd. Then it's a matter of either matchup or what they want to do defensively, or what have you. Of course, you have Peyton Scott coming back, and you mentioned Mevis. So, yes, we'll get into exactly what that looks like in the months ahead. But in terms of what the end result will be, which will be obviously awfully important for all involved, I think it's still extraordinarily early to even suggest what this team will or won't look like in that regard. Because for as much as they added a ton, probably as much or more than anyone in the country, and they needed to. Frankly, I think there's still questions, not just in terms of, exactly what will this look like. We got time to figure that part out. I'm talking more in the sense of Philly is still the only true center on the team. And that was not exactly an area that they can sit there and say they felt extraordinarily confident about entering next season with that. They didn't go out and add a true 5 in that sense. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go with a couple of forwards, or that, plenty of women's college basketball teams who make it don't have that kind of true 5 player. All true. And could Muhammad do it in a spot? Sure. And could, one of the freshmen do it? Again, possible. All sorts of things to be seen. But that doesn't mean that, I don't want to make too little of what has been a very, very big and productive month for them, no question. But let's not make too much of it either. Adding what they added did not turn this team from worst in the Pac-12 to the number 3 or 4 team in the Big Ten when they walk in next season. The Big Ten is still loaded, and they're coming in with, as we know, the LA schools, who are each going to be preseason top 10. In USC's case, probably preseason number 1.
Yeah, that USC team is a freaking juggernaut, man. So, that is unbelievable what they've done down there.
So when you're joining a league where, yes, Iowa loses Caitlin Clarke and Gabby Marshall, and they're going to be going through quite an offseason overhaul of their own. They're not going to be the juggernaut they were. No, they're not. But Indiana's still real good, and Ohio State's still real good, and SC is one of the top teams in the country, and UCLA's every bit as good as they were, if not perhaps better. We'll see by the time we get to that. Yeah, that's what I say. For as much as they've done, and they've done a ton, and for all of those who were calling for change and wanting change and whatever, well, what can I tell you other than you're just going to have to stomach the situation by way of a greatly overhauled roster where, objectively, yes, while they lost their 2 best and most productive players from a season ago, I would find it hard to, at this point, for anyone to make an intelligent argument as to why this team isn't significantly better, more talented, and will have more success next season with this current composition, regardless of how it all comes together, what personnel rotations look like, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, no matter how
depth
much
alone.
Yeah, on depth alone, they have way more talent than they did. They have more shooting. They have more experience. And frankly, like the bar, you're talking about improving. Like the bar was so low at the end of last year that it's pretty hard not to improve upon what we saw. I mean, just game in and game out, the level of just struggle that we saw from that team. But yeah, no, I agree. I think that this team absolutely is more talented than last year's, and has an opportunity to make some noise certainly in the conference. But they face such a gauntlet of a schedule against Big Ten teams that are unquestionably talented, and some of them among the best in the country.
Yeah, I mean, let's call it what it is. I mean, we've got plenty of months ahead to get into the season. We've got more than 5 months before we even really get into basketball to this level of depth. But because of the volume of players and the situation, we're going to talk about it a bit today. But, look, will outside expectations, hell, even internal expectations, probably be for this team to be a tournament team next year, particularly after adding Kelly? Yeah, probably. Whether or not they will, I don't know. But whether they are the number 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 team in the Big Ten next season, that is still considerably better than the number 12 team in the Pac-12 with how things ended last season. Whether they make the tournament or just on the outside of it or whatever, and well, in some degree, could that be disappointing? Sure. But have they gone about and tried to add as much as they could to shore up as many areas as possible? Yeah. Did they land the number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 player in the portal? No, probably not. No, they didn't. But Deja Kelly was a top 10 player in the portal for the entirety of the spring, not just by the time she added. By the time she added, she was either number 1 or 2. But in totality, did they add a high-end player? Yes. Did they add multiple, probably top 25 to 30 players in the portal, with Muhammad specifically? Yeah. Did they go, and in terms of defensively, with Mevis specifically, and where they had no ability to create turnovers at all last year, and they went out and did that immediately? Yeah. So in terms of an area, all areas that they needed to make significant upgrades, they did. Does that mean that they're a preseason top 25 team, or should be? No. We don't have to have all those answers today. But to say that, look, this staff could have rightly been criticized for how and why they got to the point they did last year in the first place, and recruiting and any number of things. And you touched on it, Ryan, whether it's recruiting, whether it's NIL, whether it's both, whatever. They got to where they got to. They had to dig out of the hole. And again, for those who wanted to change and were calling for change and weren't confident that change was going to be possible if things stayed the same by way of leadership, well, now you see that it is.
It is.
What does that mean in terms of results? We'll find out.
Yeah, exactly. But, like who knows what's going to necessarily happen on the court, but either way, like you have to think about this in the context that progress isn't a straight line too. Like obviously the goal for this team is going to be to make the NCAA tournament, and that would be really the ultimate sign of progress for a program that has been nowhere near it in the last couple of years. But I don't think it's even necessarily tournament or bust. I think that if you're showing these signs of progress and you head in the right direction, that's Kelly Graves making the argument that they are, and that things are going in the right direction. Yeah,
in a league where, while it may be different compared to what the Pac-12 was in women's basketball, again, they're coming in with 2 teams who will be in the top 10, where I don't think the degree of talent is going to be a problem in the Big Ten, not just next season, but in the years ahead in women's college basketball. I think they're going to be an awfully competitive league in that regard. So showing progress in that league, how it stacks up to what the Pac-12 just was or wasn't, doesn't matter. Having and showing that kind of progress will be significant. Yeah, we got plenty of time to figure out what it all looks like by way of personnel, rotations, et cetera, et cetera. But bottom line, a very, very productive and significant month for the women's basketball program. Switching to the men's side, where has also has had a number of transfers, not 7, but 3 so far, and still a degree of uncertainty, so we'll go less on them, because there's still the question of Enfali Dante and this waiver process and where it'll stand, and it's not a matter of whether it should or shouldn't get approved. Who are we to say one way or the other? If you go by the letter of the rule, I'm not going to say the law, because the law is a whole other matter here, which may or may not get involved. And there's legal implications of an appeals process going on in New York with 2 St. John's players, and whether or not they'll get eligibility and whatever. For Ducks fans who obviously just want their best player to get another year in order to make this team more competitive, and want to present the most sympathetic case imaginable in order to say that Enfali Dante is quote unquote deserving of it. This isn't a matter of deserving or just or you feel for a young man who obviously dealt with the injuries he did earlier in his career, or any of those things. This is simply by the letter of the rules, as everyone has known them throughout his career, that a situation like his could play out. And by the eligibility clocks and the way that NCAA rules work, he is supposed to be out of eligibility. Now, they'll still try, but as a result of that uncertainty, a Cliff Omarui, who may have been considering Oregon, was no longer going to sit idly and kick rocks down and keep on punting in terms of when he was going to make his decision. He went ahead and made his decision. And I'm not saying they automatically would have gotten him, but there were schools who were in the race at the end, and by the time it got to that point, Oregon was no longer in the race. Now, not to say that what will or won't happen with N'Faly Dante's waiver process, but Oregon has had to shift gears and start to reconfigure who they might be pursuing at center if and assuming that Dante's waiver is not approved, or the legal process doesn't play out whereby he would get another year back. He's off to the NFL Combine here this weekend as we record this here on Thursday. So we'll see. And if he is off to the pros and that's where it's going to be, certainly the best of luck to him. He had what was a tremendous last couple of seasons, injuries notwithstanding. In terms of what the center position will look like beyond Nate Biddle and, yes, then the freshman who's coming in, yeah, they're still pursuing a couple of guys. So that's where we say, while the roster, that might be the only area where there's a degree of question and uncertainty at this point. Yeah, but it is. but that's a pretty significant one when we're talking about whether or not Dante's back, and then therefore who's the other person if he's not. Having said that, at all the other positions, when you add in Brandon Angel, Raheem Moss, TJ Bamba, in particular, those three, that is quite the set of additions, all seniors. So you add them to a roster that Keyshawn Barthelemy already set to come back. Whether Dante does or doesn't, that's your senior core, and realistically speaking, that's probably, with Bamba and Angel, definitely two of your starters, and Moss might be a third, or at least a pretty significant player off the bench at minimum. But with Angel and Bamba, I would say quite confidently that those will probably be two of your starters, with Shellstad, Biddle, and then whether or not it's Moss or Tracy or whoever else it may or may not be on the big side, depending on who the matchup is. That's awfully good. And then regardless of what exactly the top five is, you still have Kwame Evans and Mookie Cook, and again, whether it's Moss or Tracy started, the other one off the bench, and Barthelemy. And yeah, that's, again, in terms of a 2 lines worth of talent, and again, I'm not looking past that as Lindsey, who's coming out of the JUCO ranks. This is a talented roster. This is a roster that, as we all know, made the tournament and made a nice run, but was losing Couisnard, probably could end up losing Dante, and was expecting to. We'll see how the waiver process plays out, but probably headed that way. What was it going to look like? Well, they added some really significant experience, shooting in particular. Those are the areas that, what did this team need to do? We'll go back a year ago, what did they need to do? They needed to add shooting. They did. Were they as good as they probably wanted to be, or as good as their talents would have allowed them to be? Quite honestly, no. Did they go out and add more of it? Yeah. Yeah, and we're a team that by the end of the season, depth was obviously a major question and concern, where we talked about what Dante and Couisnard did in the tournament because they literally couldn't leave the floor. Yeah, they've added enough depth to where, even for a program that has dealt with more injuries than any over the last couple of seasons, that now you can confidently say, regardless of whatever else may happen here this offseason in terms of any other addition, that this is a much more talented top to bottom and variance of talent, so therefore just deeper team than it has been, not just this past season, but probably for a couple of years now, probably since the 1920 season, because even the 2021 season, the starting 5, maybe even top 6, were awfully good. And then if you go back to that roster, believe it or not, like an Aaron Estrada was on that team, and then what he went on to become. yeah, they had depth of talent in 2021, but in terms of caliber of it, truly, probably since the 1920 season, and we never know what that team could have, would have, should have achieved had it made the tournament. This, on paper, is probably the deepest men's basketball roster Oregon's had in the last 5 years, and that's awfully good. Again, heading into a Big Ten where you're going to have to play in far tougher venues where the average attendance across the league outside of Northwestern is way, way higher. The road environments are going to be considerably more difficult top to bottom for Oregon in the Big Ten than they ever were in the Pac-12 by a country mile.
Yeah, totally different experience in terms of the crowds, and not only with that, but with the ability to make a run in the tournament. I mean, that 2017 team, like, ask them how much experience and depth matters at those different positions, and they are a perfect example. And there are a lot of old guard coaches too, in a lot of credit to Dana Altman. There are a lot of the old guard coaches in college basketball that have not adjusted, I think, as quickly to the NIL era as Dana has, and as successfully. So, what he's been able to do in the types of additions, not just making additions, not just throwing money at whatever kid you think has potential or talent, but, guys that fit that mold of the program. You think about a guy like TJ Bamba as a good example, right? A two-way guy that, you lose Jermaine Couisnard. That's obviously, he was the heart and soul of that team along with Dante last year. But he in Bamba is the type of guy that can step into that type of a role and be sort of the two-way vocal leader who has been in a elite college basketball program at Villanova. And you add obviously other players like Brandon Angel, Raheem Moss, guys that, add things that you might have been missing last year. Like, there's plenty to be optimistic about. It's funny that, we're talking about these three teams. We're talking about the football team, the women's and men's basketball teams, and all three of them, looking at how they've retooled their rosters and adjusted going into the Big Ten, it's interesting seeing that all three of them have improved and all have varying levels of optimism that fans can have about it. As I think especially football and men's basketball, but all three really it's something to behold, and is kind of cool for fans, I would imagine.
Yeah, and then before we even getting into the games, the individual matchups and road trips and those sorts of things. Obviously, we've talked quite a bit about that in football before, but with the men's basketball opponent rotations being both men's and women's basketball opponent rotations being announced over the last week or so, seeing exactly who will be coming to Eugene next season in that regard, and then who they'll be visiting. That's what I talk about. The caliber of what those road games is going to look like. On the men's side, they've been to Michigan before, but they got to go to Michigan and Michigan State, Ohio State, Penn State, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin. It's not a matter of what those rosters look like right now, whether they'll win. I'm talking about, but going to Wisconsin in, let's call it probably January or February in basketball, that's not going to Cal. Where of course, they lost last season. These are going to be real challenges here. These are going to be really hellacious environments for this team to have to be dealing with on a regular basis in the Big Ten going forward. So while they are probably better on paper, and while they will stack up nicely and should be expected to be a tournament team, all true, the caliber of the schedule just in conference play is going to be awfully difficult. And then, yes, again, on the women's side, by way of where the games will be component of things, hosting Indiana and Iowa and the LA schools, that's the good part. Certainly that helps. But traveling to Michigan, Ohio State, Nebraska, these are not easy. These are really difficult games to be traveling to in that regard. So lots to be excited about, optimistic about. Well, obviously, again, on the basketball side of things, get into it much, 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 much more when we get throughout the offseason. Teams will get together, in terms of the actual players will finally arrive on campus for the transfers, get a sense of what those workouts may look like, and fall practice and the like. But in terms of how this personnel starts to look like for both teams on paper and things to be looking forward to, excited about, and the move to the Big Ten, boy, yes, lots of degrees of optimism and excitement in that regard for this program. And then, of course, on the football side, again, as we do all the time, lots to discuss and talk about and feel awfully good about. But with the move to the 12-team playoff era and format, along with the move to the Big Ten, I think that again, we're going to be preaching to the choir here and our listeners and readers. But I think the perception of Oregon football from some in the Big Ten, and I say some, I'm not saying everybody certainly. For the diehards, I don't think the Ohio State fan base or even portions of the Michigan fan base have to be convinced about the caliber of football that Oregon's going to be coming in with, because those fan bases are very, very keen to and aware of what's going on a day-to-day basis. I think some in what was the Big Ten West will be getting a bit of a rude awakening, because I don't think, and rightly or wrongly, look, if you guys are Oregon fans, how many of them were pulling up watching, Iowa versus, Purdue? Probably not a whole lot. That wasn't necessarily a game that you were pulling up a whole lot before. Well, conversely, I don't think there are a lot of folks in that side of the conference who were paying a lot of attention to Pac-12 football to necessarily know how good or not Oregon was, or is going to be as they enter the Big Ten. I think there's going to be a significant portion of that conference who hears and sees and during talking season this time of year, all these projections about what Oregon's going to be, and hears from the Oregon fan base about how confident people may be, and start going, why, how, what? And they aren't following exactly all the things we're talking about in terms of depth, in terms of, they can hear about how Dylan Gabriel came here, but they don't know about everybody else in depth, and they're not supposed to. And for that matter, again, our listeners and readers probably don't know every which thing on the depth charts of those teams, whether they're playing them or not. And that's what we have the next several months to get into, is exactly how and where they'll stack up and how everybody else in the Big Ten will stack up. And that's where a lot of the offseason will start to be shifted to in our regard, is getting into the Big Ten move and how some of those programs look and the like, and that'll be our discussions in the weeks and months ahead. But for this week and for this edition of the Ducks Confidential podcast, that will do it for us, and we'll be wrapping up this one. So we thank you, as always, for taking the time. Make sure to like, subscribe, 5-star review, all those good things, so that way more people can engage with it, seen by more folks. And feel free to always shoot us messages, emails, et cetera, and we can look to answer any questions during or aside from the podcast in editions ahead. So for Ryan Clarke, I'm James Crepea. We will see you on the next edition of the Ducks Confidential podcast.